Welcome to the Dr. Todd Talks Tunes show, everyone. I am your host, Dr. Todd Samra, and today we are talking about Antonio Vivaldi. And Van Halen equals Antonio Vivaldi. And what do I really mean by that? Well, I really want to give an introduction to Antonio Vivaldi, but I want to start by connecting it with the rock of the 1980s. So real quick, just a little bit about who Antonio Vivaldi is. He was born in 1678 and he dies in 1741. So he's 7 years older than Bach and he dies 9 years before Bach. So that gives a little bit of a time frame. And during their lifetimes, he was the more famous composer. As a matter of fact, Bach really thought Vivaldi was a great composer, was a big fan, and thought he was a great, really, writer of melodies, a melody writer. And Bach kind of learned a bit about how to write melodies from studying the music of Vivaldi. So that alone makes him important. He spent most of his life working at the Opus Dei delle Pietà. And the Opus Dei delle Pietà was an orphanage for girls, for unwanted girls. And what he did there is he wrote a lot of music for specific girls that went to the orphanage. So we think of the Four Seasons, we think of that being his most famous piece of music ever. Well, it was specifically written for specific girls. So what I want to do is draw some parallels, though, between his style, and not look at the Four Seasons, but look at his other concertos. Draw some parallels between his style and some of the music that comes from the 1980s. And so we start with a little bit of Van Halen. And what I want to do is play just a short little excerpt that comes from a guitar solo of Eddie Van Halen, and it's a relatively short solo. So here we go. Let's listen to a little Running with the Devil. So what we really just heard was he's going up, he plays a musical figure, he goes down a step, he plays essentially the same musical figure, and then he goes back up again. Well, when you play that same motive and you go down a step, you can keep going down another step and another step. It's called a sequence. The musical term for that is a sequence. And a sequence is one of those things that we find commonly in the Late Baroque and very commonly in 80s rock. I want to play a little bit of Judas Priest and Electric Eye. Rockin', up-tempo. And that's another thing too. When we look at these concertos of Antonio Vivaldi, which are during the early days of the concerto, we normally see a structure that is fast, slow, fast. So basically they have a fast movement, slow movement, fast movement. And a movement or a concerto isn't technically a song. A song is basically a small genre for just a few number of people. A symphony is a large genre, and in other words, it takes a lot of people to play it, and it's a very long piece of music. It's really for the orchestra. A concerto, the concerto really developed, it was of course for orchestra, but it involves soloists. And really what it was for was to represent contrasts. We could have loud by everybody playing, and then quiet by just a few people playing. And then these few people were your really, really good players. So you could write very intricate things for them, and then you could write more general things for other people. And we see that in the concertos, and we also see that in a lot of rock and roll stuff too. I want to play a little bit of Still Loving You by the Scorpions, and what I want to do is take it up here a little bit, and you know, this has the same kind, this ballad has the same kind of progression. A very similar progression to what we would see in music from the end of the Baroque, middle of the 18th century. Here we go. Those chords aren't terribly different than the chords I played from the Winter example at the beginning of the show, the Vivaldi example. The chords are relatively similar to one another. Now, I know the aesthetic and the sound is a little bit different, but the fundamentals musically are pretty much the same. Here's an example. Dokken. Breaking the chains, man. So we're going to forward up here. So largely triadic. What I mean by that is there's not a lot of seventh chords or ninth chords or suspensions and non-harmonic tones. It's primarily triadic music, and it's just these basically solos and melodies written above essentially a chord progression. Now we're going to make a little bit of a departure, and we're going to go back and listen to a little bit of Vivaldi, and essentially the fundamentals are the same. Let's listen to a little bit of the Vivaldi. Here we go. Whoops. Huh? Bum 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 ba da 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 sequence. Dun 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 da 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 da. Another sequence. Dun 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 da 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 da. Now another one. So as you can see, the fundamental characteristics musically are the same. Sure, the sound is different. Sure, it's played here by like a Baroque orchestra on these string instruments. That's what Vivaldi wrote it for. But the music fundamentals underneath of it are essentially the same. Here's a little bit of another concerto. You can hear it musically is just relatively simple. And so what Vivaldi was doing is kind of taking basic formulae and writing them for all of these different concertos. Now there's a joke, I don't really like it. People say that Vivaldi wrote the same concerto 500 times. And it's kind of a little bit of a put down. He did write 500 concertos, which is amazing. And almost half of them are for solo violin. So we can see that as kind of being that dominant instrument of that time period in much the same way like the electric guitar is the dominant instrument in a rock band. Very much plays the lead, the other instruments get out of the way, they can jam all together. So like this next example we're going to play, the concerto in A major, everybody plays together at the beginning in total unison, which is like kind of a solid rock and roll thing to do. And then the background instruments get out of the way and the soloist gets a chance to shine. So all together here. Now here's the soloist. Oh my gosh, can you not hear that like on electric guitar? That's kind of like the same type of thing. It's showing off in the same way. And it's using the same range because it creates a very clear separation between the background instruments and the soloist. And that's why so often guitar players do go high up on the neck of the guitar and play, because they're by playing higher, they can separate themselves more clearly from these lower instruments. So when we look at this music, we look at the we look at the complexity of it. We look at the similarities between what we have in Antonio Vivaldi and what we have in rock and roll music, and they're not terribly different from one another. I do like that Vivaldi custom wrote music specifically for students that he had. I think that's a real noble thing. I had a high school teaching job between my master's and my doctorate, and I was the orchestra director. And one year we did the Vivaldi concerto for 4 violins because I had 2 senior ladies and 2 junior gentlemen who were all pretty good, and it just kind of worked out nicely. And what I had to do is I had to understand the skill set of those 4 players and assign them the correct solo part that matched their skill set. So obviously the hardest one of the 4 went to my principal, my concert master, and so on and so forth. And so it really was an opportunity for them to show off their individual skills, but at things that were appropriate for them. And a lot of these concertos, I played a lot of them in high school. My college audition, I played the Vivaldi concerto in A minor for my scholarship audition, for example. I played a lot of these pieces and got a lot out of them, had a lot of fun playing them, and then I'd go home and I'd listen to Motley Crue. And so to me, I've always kind of made this connection between the essential simple fundamentals of 1980s rock and roll and what we have with the fundamentals of this late Baroque, middle of the 18th century music from Vivaldi and Bach and Corelli and some of these other composers that were writing this instrumental music during this time. So what I want to do with this episode is kind of is not a classical. It's maybe more of a classical episode than a rock and roll episode. But what I kind of want to do is take people that like rock and roll and turn them on to Vivaldi, and people that like Vivaldi turn them on to a little bit of the rock and roll. So really, it's kind of a balance between those things. And of course, the last show was Stevie Nicks and Hildegard von Bingen, so we were doing that a little bit last time too. As a matter of fact, going forward next week, I'm very excited. We're going to talk about Quincy Jones and Dr. Dre and how they essentially fostered a lot of artists that were coming up, and really a lot of the important music today really came about because of a foundation that was created by these two men. Then the week after that, episode 21 is going to be John Adams's Short Ride in a Fast Machine versus Rush's Red Barchetta, songs about cars or traveling in cars, and it's going to be kind of cool to compare those. So I'm very much excited in some of these episodes here recently to combine elements, not just have one episode be totally about this classical or that kind of rock and roll music, but to combine them to show there are a lot of similarities between the Baroque and modern day rock and roll. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Please subscribe to our channel. And once again, thank you for tuning in. Dr. Todd Talks Tunes. See you next time.